Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is an exclusive episode with His Royal and Imperial Highness Archduke Dr. Géza von Habsburg. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'd like to read Dr. Habsburg's bio for the audience because it is exquisite. As I mentioned, His Royal and Imperial Highness Dr. Géza von Habsburg is an internationally renowned expert on Fabergé and has curated and published extensively on the subject. With a PhD in art history, he has more than 40 years of experience in Russian art, old master paintings, European porcelain, silver and gold, and objects of virtu. Dr. Habsburg has published 14 books, curated 6 major exhibitions attracting more than 2 million visitors, acts as an expert at international airfairs including TIFAF, and lectures worldwide at museums and universities. Fluent in 7 languages, Dr. Habsburg spent his early career in Europe as chairman of Christie's Europe and as chairman of Habsburg Fine Art International Auctioneers. He was recently appointed visiting professor at Okayama University in Japan and acts as guest curator of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, where he organized the 2011 exhibition Fabergé Revealed. Dr. von Habsburg is the great-great-grandson of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, also King of Hungary, and grandson of King Frederick Augustus II of Saxony. Wow, what an extraordinary life you've led.
Well, you make it sound extraordinary. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Although I began my life as a refugee, and we left Hungary in 1944 when the Russians invaded our country, lost everything, were basically paupers for the next 20 years. But I've not regretted one single moment. I have a PhD in history of art and archaeology, and consider myself actually really very lucky to have led such a charmed life in spite of having lost everything previously.
What was it like to be at a university in Switzerland? How was that experience?
Well, Switzerland was only the beginning because I actually went on from there to Munich University and then to Florence. So I have a really very international background. And Fribourg University, where I went to, was tiny compared to all the colleges and universities in the United States. I think we were a dozen people studying art history, and the whole university may have comprised, 3,000 students only.
Wow. Let me ask you this question. What does it feel like to be a royal?
Question that I'm always asked. It feels like nothing that one can talk about. I mean, basically, I'm down to earth. That's how we were brought up, knowing full well that we had to earn our living, my younger brother and I. And we do have large family gatherings, and usually in Austria or in Hungary. So those are wonderful, but to be a royal doesn't really mean very much unless one takes it very seriously and its responsibilities, which means if you have children, and I have 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, you have to pass on to them responsibilities which maybe not every normal human being has. We're all very religious, we're all Catholic. That is something that we pass on. And we all have a high sense of morals and ethics, which we also try to pass on to our children. So it's more a responsibility than a pleasure to be a royal nowadays.
Thank you for explaining that. Let me ask you this. You were a visiting professor at Okayama University in Japan. I've been to Japan and I love it so much. There's such a correlation between Japanese, the refinement of their art and also Fabergé's refinement. Did you feel that connection? Did it inspire you?
I have lectured on Fabergé. I hold two kinds of lecture. One to undergraduates, and one to the public, large public lectures. I do have to admit that I have problems in as far as I speak English, no Japanese, sadly. I have interpreters who try to understand. I mean, I send them my text in advance. They try to understand what I'm saying. The students have no clue about what I am talking about. There is a certain lack of culture, the type of culture that we talk about, European culture. Mm-hmm. They know very little about it. They do not speak any languages, or virtually none. So it's quite a problem to teach them. But on the other hand, as you quite rightly point out, they are highly sensitive, wonderful people, and I enjoy my years or my studies, my teachings in Japan very much indeed. I look forward to it every year.
Now, please share the 7 languages that you speak.
Well, born Hungarian, mother German. We lived in Portugal for 10 years. You have that. I lived in Italy for 2 years. French, I lived in Geneva for 10 years. I'm not sure how far we are. Spanish, because I love Spanish literature and I've always studied it. Not sure what's missing still.
Well, definitely there's fantastic English as well. Now, your great-great-grandfather, as well as King Frederick Augustus. I want to ask you this question. Союз трех императоров. So the three emperors league between Russia, Germany, and your great-grandfather. Can you describe that?
You are asking me difficult historic questions. Are we speaking now of the 1812 event where Alexander I and Emperor Francis I, and at that time there was no Emperor of Germany, but Emperor Napoleon? That was one of the tripartite meetings of royalty. Which you are referring to? Which one?
Referring to the one where your great-grandfather, Emperor Franz Joseph, along with the Russian and German emperors together unified. I just wanted to know if there was an experience that came out of that was passed down, about any kind of, I don't know, special, friendship or power or anything of that sort.
The Austrian and German emperors were cousins, so they were related. The Russian emperor was also a cousin, Nicholas II. So they were all related, but in the end, if we're talking now of 1914, it didn't really lead to very much, because each one had his agenda. So Emperor Wilhelm II, if this is where the event we're talking about, had a very belligerent land-grabbing policy for Germany. And dear Franz Joseph, he was at that time well into his late 60s, if not 70s, and he was led by the ministers of war who prevailed at that time. And dear Nicholas II, I mean, he was at that time, Russia believed that they would conquer and that they were going to be the greatest nation from among the three, and it all turned out very, very differently. All three of them lost their thrones.
That's very interesting. Now, also, King Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, I just wanted to clarify, is Saxony similar to Germany as Monaco is to France?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. Can you repeat?
Sure. So King Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, who you were related to, Saxony itself, Dresden was the capital, right? It was part of Germany, but it was kind of on its own?
It was, well, before 1871, when Prussia became an empire and many of the dukedoms, kingdoms, and electorates joined Kaiser Wilhelm I. Dresden, Saxony was not really different. It started off as an electorate, became a kingdom, but not of Saxony, kingdom of Poland, and not kings of Saxony. So not really all that different. What happened in Saxony that in 1918, after World War I, the King of Saxony, or the Elector of Saxony, King of Poland, lost his throne and was basically removed from power and given his marching orders. So my grandfather and all his children really did not enjoy having all the accoutrements of ruling in Saxony at that time.
I see. And then right as we enter the conversation about Fabergé, which is the key element here, I just want to also bring up the Austro-Hungarian monarchy called, is it correct, Kisylvania?
No. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy came to be in 1867. You got me there. Exactly. Transylvania, which is, I think, what you are referring to, was part of Hungary at certain times, and therefore was very much part of the whole. I think we better leave that.
Okay.
That's too complicated.
Sounds good.
You can.
Sure. I've visited Transylvania. I absolutely loved it. Okay. Now let's begin the conversation about Fabergé. There's a new book coming out, your latest of many, called Fabergé, Treasures of Imperial Russia. The first publication is by Rizzoli Electa. This book is in partnership with the St. Petersburg Fabergé Museum, where the original first hen egg is. And I'd like to first ask you this question. What interested you in Fabergé? How did you come to find the beauty of it?
Way back in 1969, I was chairman of Christie's in Switzerland. I received a phone call and was asked to go and look at the contents of a house on Lake Geneva. And hey presto, there was a large safe in the kitchen with no key. And with the help of a locksmith, I had it broken open, and it was full of objects of art by this extraordinary artist about whom I had never heard anything. Remember that I was straight out of university. I knew all about Rembrandt and Michelangelo and Gothic cathedrals, but Faberge meant nothing. That is when I learned to understand and to love Fabergé, because when I auctioned those objects in Geneva in 1970, it's caused a huge stir, because this type of object, no imperial eggs please, but very beautiful objects of art, fetched tremendous prices, and people traveled from afar in their private planes to come and bid on these objects, and that really set me on a career. I think I have traveled 23 times, if not more, to St. Petersburg, studied in the archives, worked together with the directors of museums and their curators, and this has somehow become my entire life.
Now, Peter Carl Fabergé, did he actually ever create anything himself, or did he oversee the creation by a multitude of artists?
Very good question. He did not. I mean, he was a master of the craft. He was also a master businessman. But to our knowledge, and there is no proof for him having made any object, to our knowledge, he actually, as you correctly said, oversaw this entire empire of his, which was spread all over Russia, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, Odessa, and also in Europe. He had a major outlet in London. His empire consisted of over 500 craftsmen who were working for him, primarily in St. Petersburg. And in Moscow, what Fabergé's role was really that of inventing, providing the ideas, probably rough sketches of the objects that he wished his various workshops to produce. And there were a number of workshops under one roof in St. Petersburg at Bolshaya Morskaya, next to St. Isaac's Cathedral. And there these 350 craftsmen would first of all create detailed designs of what Fabergé had in mind, and then these things were executed in the various workshops under his direct care. There's a nice little story which describes Fabergé in the middle of this vast house, which still exists today, with a hammer in his hand. And each object would have to be submitted to him for his approval. And if he thought that this was not up to the quality and standards of what he demanded, the hammer would come down and smash the object.
Just like Thor.
Story, I don't believe it for a minute, but it does really exemplify the high standard that this firm had under Fabergé of producing the most perfect, most exquisite objects of their time.
That's, talk about this show being called Archetypal Mosaic. That directly relates to the archetype of Thor, which was geographically located pretty close to St. Petersburg, interestingly enough. Now, back to... so if he was the architect, was he also, as you mentioned, the quality control person? So he was there at the beginning and at the end, correct, of each production?
That is very well put. Yes, exactly.
Okay, great. Now, I've had the pleasure, since I'm from St. Petersburg, to see a lot of the original eggs, both in the Moscow Armory and the Virginia Museum when it came to Vegas, and in Ohio and many other locations. Tell me, my favorite egg probably would be the Peter the Great egg. What are some of your favorite eggs and why?
A difficult choice. one should first of all explain what these eggs were, because they were really, truly a totally out of the ordinary series of objects. Well, we know that 50 of them were commissioned, 2 were not completed. The first egg was 1885. The last completed egg was 1916. 2 eggs were in work in 1917, but were never delivered to the Tsar. Of those 50 eggs, the first 10 were made as commissions of Tsar Alexander III as Easter presents for his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna, who was a born princess of Denmark. So that accounts for 10. His son, Alexander's son, Nicholas II, continued the tradition, but he commissioned 2 eggs every year, namely one for his wife, a German princess of Hessen, Alexandra Feodorovna, and for his mother. So his mother, Maria Feodorovna, ended up with the largest collection of all. And what happened in 1917 was that Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. All the eggs were at that time still in the imperial palaces in St. Petersburg, in the private apartments of the Tsar and Tsarina. And what happened then is that the Bolshevik state, the new republic in 1917, seized all these treasures and sent them to Moscow for safekeeping. This is the Russian Revolution, where many pieces were destroyed and lost and stolen. So all the eggs, with the exception of 8, which disappeared at that time. So 42 of the eggs were sent to Moscow and kept in the Kremlin until 1923, when the Russians started considering these objects of art as possible objects that could be sold to the West. The Russians at that time, the Bolsheviks, had absolutely no interest whatsoever in these treasures and would have sold their own grandmothers, I think. We're talking of 1918, 1920. There was a huge famine in Russia at that time. Lenin's first 5-year plan was not working. They needed desperate money to finance industrial equipment, tractors, and so on, to be able to move the economy along. So with that, all the eggs, with the exception of all the 40 eggs, with the exception of 10, which are today in the Moscow Armory Museum, were sold to the West.
Now, but what would be some of your favorites?
My favorite, I understand your love for the Peter the Great egg of 2003. That's I have held it in my hands many a time, as I have held almost every single one of Fabergé's eggs in my hands. I may be one of the very few people, maybe the only person who has had this honor. My favorite piece is the winter egg, which was commissioned in 1913 by the Tsar, by Nicholas. And it is a rock crystal egg. It consists of 3 pieces of rock crystal, 2 forming the shell of the egg itself, and the base being rock crystal, which is carved to simulate a melting ice flow. And both the upper pieces and the base are encrusted with tiny diamonds set in platinum rivulets. And inside, when it opens, has a basket of spring flowers. Now, this object had disappeared in 1949, was last seen, and reappeared in the when was it, in the 90s, and came up for auction and fetched a world record price then, came up in New York at auction and fetched a world record price then, $9.6 million then, and today is owned by a Middle Eastern potentate. And I've asked this gentleman how much he would accept for the egg. I said, would you accept, I don't know, 30 million? He smiled. 40? He smiled even more broadly. I said, 50? He said, no, wow. It's not for sale.
Amazing.
So that I think is the most brilliant of all the eggs, because it's made out of nothing and is worth that kind of money.
That's an exquisite story. Now, objects of virtue, does that symbolize mostly Italian objects of virtuoso, pretty much? Is that where the term comes from? And how does that relate to the other Fabergé objects? For example, in the armory in Moscow, there's so many intricate, exquisite little flowers and things that when one sees them, one imagines, like, how is that even possible to make? They're so refined. How do they last? How do they not break? It's just amazing.
Yeah, good comment. What very few people know is that the Imperial Easter eggs, I mentioned that there were 50 of them, represents less than 1% of what the Fabergé firm produced. We know that over 350,000 objects were made by the firm, and each one of a kind. Now, there was a lot of silver, which the Bolsheviks all melted down, so there's very little of it left. There was a lot of jewelry, which the Bolsheviks broke up and sold for the value of their stones. So very little of that is left, but what is left is what you described: flowers and little animals and objects of art, objects of virtue. And the good question to ask is, why have these survived as opposed to all the rest of Fabergé's pieces? And the answer is very simple: because these objects were of smallish intrinsic value. The semi-precious stones that form many of them, the animals, flowers, and many of the objects of virtue, were inexpensive and are still inexpensive. So what you are buying is, or what you are looking at, and what is so extraordinary, because so unique, is this genius of Fabergé, who, together with his brother Agathon, his 4 sons, his design studio, invented and created and oversaw the production of all these tens of thousands of objects, and each one of a kind. So they have survived for that very reason, because people collected them then, and the Bolsheviks saw that there was a demand for them and did not destroy these objects. The Americans were large buyers of these objects of virtue, these objects of art, as were the Brits and many other countries, because they are truly so unique and so marvelous.
It would be amazing, it would have been amazing, and it would be amazing if anything like this ever happens again, if there's always 2 pieces created, one for the party requesting and one for the archives, so that nothing can ever be fully destroyed. Tell me, now, the first egg was the original hen egg, which is a white egg, and inside is a small hen, and inside is a small pendant. Now, that pendant is the egg is currently in the St. Petersburg Fabergé Museum. The pendant has been lost. Have you held that first egg? Because I have a very strong interest in that egg. Just it's so interesting, And when you held it, did it give you any kind of archetypal feeling? This is the first. This is the original one.
Special vibes. What I love about that egg, well, you describe it correctly, but you have missed out that there is the outside is a white shell made out of enamel. The inside is a further egg, but it is the yolk of the egg, so it's made of gold. That opens up, and there is a hen inside it. The hen opened up, and there was a crown inside it. And inside of the crown was this ruby drop. And if you bear with me, there's a fascinating correspondence between between Tsar Alexander III and his brother Grand Duke Vladimir about this egg, and this is not very well known because it's never been published. And Alexander writes to his brother, "I am grateful to you, dear Vladimir, for the trouble you have taken in placing the order and for the execution of the order itself, which could not have been more successful. The workmanship is really very fine and exquisite. Your instructions for the delicate handling of the objects are so explicit that I was able to carry them out easily and with complete success. I hope that the egg, which cost more than the whole, this little ruby drop, which cost more than the whole egg, I do hope that the egg will have the desired effect on its future owner." So that is where it all started. And as you correctly say, I mean, this object absolutely charmed the Empress Maria Feodorovna and set off this extraordinary series of objects which stand absolutely as one-of-a-kind objects created by one jeweler, 50 objects. Imagine the challenge each year of producing one and then two objects. None were allowed to be duplicates, so each one had to be invented on its own. And what the Tsar insisted upon is that the eggs were not to have any political or historical meaning. They were all to show events in the personal lives of the Tsar and Tsarina. So often you find the children shown in miniatures, or the yachts in which they used to go on holiday, or the train in which they used to travel around, the palaces in which they live. All of these are depicted as the surprises of these eggs. Quite magical, I have to say.
Do you know if the Fabergé brand ever created crowns for any of the royals?
Crowns. The crowns that were worn by the royals were made by other jewelers. There was Boleyn and there was Hahn. They made crowns which were worn at coronation ceremonies, but Fabergé made diadems and necklaces and you name it. There's one album of designs which has 4,000 jewelry designs. All of these pieces, or virtually all, have been destroyed and lost. But they show what an extraordinary jeweler Fabergé also was.
Now, tell me, do you think there's anything comparable to Fabergé in the world, or ever has been? Because in my taste, Fabergé is number one.
Absolutely, I share your opinion totally. You might speak of great jewelers like Cartier or Boucheron or Tiffany. Funny, there is an amusing anecdote about Faberge being interviewed in 1914 about those specific three jewelers. And he said, kind of looking down his nose, one imagines, he said, Tiffany, Cartier, and Boucheron are people of commerce. Meaning that, and saying so, if you wish to buy a $1 million ruble necklace of diamonds and of pearls, that's where you go. But I am the artist craftsman, and that's where he stands out a mile and is totally, utterly different. Others try to copy him, imitate him, but none succeeded.
Now, not too long ago, there was a Fabergé egg found in some kind of a yard sale or something of that nature. And I was wondering, how likely is that? Of course, it's highly unlikely, but how likely is that? And how likely is it possibly to be counterfeit?
Well, I've held this piece in my hands, and it too is just incredibly, beautifully crafted. The one thing that sort of proved its authenticity is that a photograph of 1902 shows that egg in a showcase of an exhibition which Fabergé held at that time. And there are counterfeits. There are many counterfeits, but you cannot really reach the incredible quality and originality of the things that Fabergé made. So this egg was really a great story. It was in all the papers, is that this scrap metal dealer went to a Midwestern yard sale. I don't know if it was a yard sale, but anyhow, and saw this piece and weighed it in his hands, and he bought it for $14,000, not knowing what it was. It had no signature or anything, so nobody knew what it was, and he bought it for the value of the gold. And he tried to sell it on to chums of his for the value of the gold, and they said, "You've overpaid it." But the incredible story then went that it turned out to be one of the missing 8 eggs in 1917, he went online and found an article which described one of these missing eggs and had it checked out, and 20 million British pounds later, he was a happy man.
That is an exquisite story. The markings and the signatures is an interesting point, because most Fabergé items, they have the Russian F, they have the workmaster's symbol, and they have the marking for the metal used. Is that correct? About 3 markings a piece?
Yes, that's correct.
And so those markings are so essential, and they prove so much. When there is a piece without a marking, how is that even possible, that it came through the shop without quality control, without the marking?
The egg in question was one of the early ones, which Fabergé didn't sign. It had the hallmark of one of the makers of Fabergé, but nobody really noticed that. Nobody knew that it was Russian. It had a Vacheron Constantin watch in it. But the answer to your question is that the hallmark means nothing. Meaning that all the forgeries are hallmark. and extremely well. So never buy a piece because it is hallmark, because many of the authentic pieces are not hallmarked or have lost their hallmarks, or only have the marks of a maker, not Fabergé, but one of his workmasters. So unless you know your history of Fabergé well enough, you wouldn't know. That is a word of warning to all those out there that the hallmark means nothing, because whether it's by laser technique or by whatever means, you can transfer marks from genuine objects to forgeries. And there you are. I've been shown hundreds, maybe tens of thousands of objects. I've sent images by email almost every day.
Wow.
Of objects which are made either in New York or in Russia or elsewhere, which I can tell immediately that is a forgery. I know the workshops in which these things are made. I know the colors that Fabergé used and the forgers don't know about. The shapes that Fabergé used and the forgers don't necessarily know about. So it takes 40 years of expertise, of learning and seeing these objects, both genuine and forgeries, for one to have the gut feeling that is necessary to identify what is good from bad.
The discernment. You definitely have the extraordinary discernment.
I'm sorry. We may have to redo that. Just a second. That was my answering phone.
I was talking...
So, do we need to go back on something?
No, we're fine. I was saying you have great discernment, and that's the key. I want to ask you a few more questions. Now, cleaning. Let's say, a Fabergé egg, a real one, is sitting in a beautiful, glass structure in a house, and it has dust on it, or, accidentally the cat touched it or something. What are the best ways of cleaning a real egg?
Cleaning, it depends on what it's made of. If it's just pure gold, you treat them as gently as possible, and you don't use any acids or anything. I would use a toothbrush and soap, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, for eggs that have that kind of value, it's best left to professionals to do that.
And in the future, since Fabergé has been rebranded and has a new presence recently, has always had kind of transitionary presences, but now is also making objects of virtue. Do you believe that future eggs, which can be commissioned, could become part of the history of Fabergé?
Yes, but there is this clear divide between what was made before 1917, before the Russian Revolution, and what has been made since. What I find that I act as advisor to the present day company is that quality can be equaled. Design is much more difficult, but what is made since the revolution is in a separate class. That having been said, the pieces that are being made now by the Fabergé company, they are exquisite. They are jeweled with colored stones and etc. We have designed and created a pearl egg for a Middle Eastern collector which is set with the most exquisite pearls. I find that these can be considered the equivalent of what Fabergé would have become today. I think that many of the things created by the Fabergé company today would have made Fabergé proud. They're different in style, and there are many people who look down on them. But objectively, I find that they are quite extraordinary objects of art and jewels.
You know, I actually have designed my own eggs, and at the right time, if I ever can, I will have it commissioned by Fabergé.
May I correct you on one thing? I don't know where you can fit that in. Is that the book about the Fabergé Museum, which is owned by Victor Vekselberg, the great billionaire who acquired the Forbes magazine collection. Some of your listeners may remember that when it was in New York, is now part of this museum in St. Petersburg. A group of objects which are part of a collection of about 1,000 pieces of Fabergé, larger than any other in the world. And this catalogue is actually a work of a number of the best Fabergé specialists who have written this. We are the advisory board of the Fabergé Museum. And we have written this book together in homage of this great museum and this great collection.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That is, dear audience, this is about the February 2018 publishing of the book called Fabergé, Treasures of Imperial Russia, which at the time of this recording is currently #1 in its category. So go ahead and pre-order or order that book, because as Dr. Habsburg has stated himself, and the people who know it best have all contributed to this book. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience?
Just that Fabergé is truly the greatest. It's funny that I should find myself saying this so often, that he is truly the greatest, most unique jeweler who ever lived, and who, together with his craftsmen, created objects of art which are totally unique. For those who live in the New York area, there's a collection of Fabergé at the Metropolitan Museum, privately owned, which has 3 of the Imperial Easter eggs as highlights. The museums in Hillwood, Washington, and in Baltimore have special Fabergé exhibitions and publications for what is this particular month, with the appearance of these 3 catalogs, of these 3 exhibitions, is truly an extraordinary moment. And please go online and check these books out on these collections, because you will be utterly amazed.
And may I ask you about Fabergé and your personal collection? Do you personally like to collect Fabergé objects, or are you commissioning your own objects as well?
I have used the Fabergés that I had to put my 3 sons through college.
Oh, great.
And I'm left with one single piece, which is an ashtray, which I don't use. But I can't afford them. They have become truly very expensive, and I've played my part in driving up these prices.
I love it. Well, I really appreciate you being on the show. Again, thank you to Your Royal and Imperial Highness, PhD Dr. Géza von Habsburg, for this extraordinary, insightful look into both Fabergé and some extensive family history.
You're very welcome.